check out Armchair History TV, where we release uncensored exclusive videos every week. We just made a video on the Russian Revolution, which will be part of an exclusive series covering the fall of the Russian Empire. Use code REVOLUTION for a completely free month subscription. You can also watch our exclusive 45-minute documentary on the 7 Years' War, which we just completed. Operation Downfall was split into two parts: Operations Olympic and Coronet. Olympic aimed to establish a staging ground by capturing airfields and ports in southern Kyushu via amphibious landings. Total occupation of the island wasn't necessary. Coronet's objective was to land on the main island's Kanto Plain and capture Tokyo. The US planned for each operation to land hundreds of thousands of men and tens of thousands of vehicles. Military leaders allocated thousands of planes, hundreds of warships, and landing crafts to support the ground troops. Meanwhile, the Japanese planned Operation Ketsugo to defend the home islands. They hoped it would be a crushing blow which could inflict enough casualties to force American leadership to accept a negotiated settlement. Japanese leadership envisioned a society that would engage in die-hard resistance from top to bottom. Every last person and resource at their disposal would be honed into weapons and tactics to destroy the invaders. Japanese propaganda boasted, "The sooner the Americans come, the better. 100 million die proudly." The Japanese military consolidated their remaining reserve armor into a mobile shock force for counterattacks against the anticipated Allied invasion. Thanks to the sponsor of today's video, World of Tanks, you can command Japanese tanks like the Type 3 Chinu, as well as legendary Allied tanks like the Sherman, in thrilling head-to-head battles. World of Tanks is a free-to-play MMO PC game that lets you take command of some of the most iconic military vehicles from the mid-20th century. Choose from a massive selection of over 800 historically accurate tanks, including artillery, heavy, medium, and tank destroyers from 11 nations. Experience tactical battle mechanics and deep strategic gameplay with 5 vehicle classes, 40+ unique maps, and various game modes. Roll across open fields, charge through deserts, and engage in fierce combat in urban zones while controlling legendary tanks like the T-34 and Tiger. New players who sign up today using our activation code COMBAT will receive an exclusive bundle: a free Tier 6 tank, Cromwell B medium tank, a 7-day premium account, 250,000 credits, plus a 10-battle rental of the Tiger 131 tank, T-78 tank destroyer, and Type 64 light tank. Don't miss out. Join over 180 million World of Tank fans and jump into the action by clicking our link in the description below. Japanese war planners correctly predicted the time and location of the American-led invasion and prepared accordingly. There were limited areas and specific times when US forces could conduct massive amphibious landings. Once ashore in Kyushu, 582,000 Allied servicemen would meet nearly 900,000 entrenched Japanese soldiers. Truman may have doubted that destroying cities and their people would defeat the Japanese Empire. After strategic firebombing failed to produce surrender, the president refused to put his trust in the atomic bomb. To Truman, a ground invasion was the only way to ensure total victory. In Japanese war rooms, Concerned army officers worried that Emperor Hirohito would be willing to accept surrender. His people were suffering under aerial bombardment, and the USSR began a massive offensive in Manchuria. Hirohito prepared to issue the imperial rescript of surrender, so rebellious elements of the army intervened. Kenji Hatanaka and Jiro Chisaki led a coup that isolated the emperor and held him prisoner. Violence and surprise worked in their favor, as the conspirators soon toppled the confused government. Muzzling the imperial household meant that Hatanaka, Chisaki, and their conspirators could find friendly allies in government and the armed forces that refused to surrender. The new government gambled on resisting the impending invasion. It didn't matter if the US and USSR were going to fight Japan together. The Japanese armed forces and people would fight to the bitter end. US Army and Navy plans kept pace with the new date set for Operation Olympic, October 1st, 1945. Allied ships gathered at Okinawa and Iwo Jima, while soldiers and Marines boarded ships bound for southern Kyushu. As the invasion time approached, the Japanese faced a serious problem. Though they have enough ammunition for the first phase of fighting, food supplies begin to dwindle. A fanatical, prolonged defense of the home islands would prove difficult if soldiers were starving. The Allies faced a serious issue of their own: typhoons. US Navy commanders planned a later landing day to avoid typhoon season and set the so-called X-Day for November 1st, 1945. Any review of Japanese history pointed to invasion fleets falling victim to violent storms called kamikaze, or divine wind. While large warships could weather the storm with some difficulty, landing craft, troop ships, and aircraft were at serious risk. A typhoon swept across Allied staging grounds and harbors on Okinawa just before X-Day. The wild weather and storm surge wrecked hundreds of planes and ships. To compensate, Allied planners extended the invasion date to December 1st, 1945. With Germany's defeat, resources could be reallocated. It would just take time. Repairing and replacing the lost equipment and men would take weeks. Delays favored Japanese defenders. Food remained an issue, but more troops, planes, and water attack aircraft were reallocated to Kyushu. The number of defending troops swelled to 900,000, with thousands of suicide motorboats, mini-subs, and kamikaze planes at the ready. US forces launched X-Day on December 1st. The threat of suicide attack craft from the air, on sea, and under the sea loomed large. Over several months of planning, the US had implemented adapted tactics to combat kamikaze attacks. Larger destroyer picket formations, low-flying combat air patrols, and airstrip bombing suppressed the threats from the air. Landing craft made their way to shore. They suffered losses from the motorboat attack craft and man-guided torpedoes. However, the most brutal fighting was yet to come. Having survived the gauntlet of suicide attacks, Allied troops reached the landing zones on Kyushu, where they immediately fought the defenders. The Japanese plan was to fight the invaders at the first opportunity, as close as possible, in order to diminish the effect of US naval gunfire. Air support proved vital to push back on the first wave of defenders. The next phase was far more complex. Soldiers and Marines fought fiercely in the hilly countryside. Dugout by dugout, cave by cave, trench by trench, Allied forces pushed the perimeter northward. The persistent threats of suicide attacks harried Allied naval forces, but air power continued to prove vital in covering the sea and land forces. No matter the Allies' adaptations to Japanese tactics, The rate of casualties surpassed war planners' expectations. Truman was horrified when he read the casualty numbers. His commitment to Operation Olympic dwindled in the face of such numbers. The president, worried that Americans would soon call for peace, had to change course. While achieving some of their objectives, Japanese commanders overestimated the number of servicemen they killed and the amount of equipment they destroyed. Initially, Japanese defenders offered staunch resistance, but the lack of food and medical supplies damaged them. They lost ground, which allowed Allied air forces and naval formations to stage further operations. The loss of military personnel and civilians was staggering, reflecting the casualty rates they suffered during the Battle of Okinawa. A change of plan, however, was in order. Truman had enough. The loss of life on Kyushu encouraged the president to cancel Operation Coronet, the planned invasion of Tokyo. To make matters worse for him, Soviet forces blitzed through Manchuria in a matter of weeks during the summer of 1945. They were poised to move on to Korea and the Japanese strongholds along the Chinese coast. Truman feared Soviet armies rapidly taking ground. Briefing his advisors in January 1946, the president finally authorized the use of atomic bombs on Japanese cities. By early 1946, the US possessed about a dozen nuclear weapons. He ordered his commanders to draw up a list of urban areas to drop the bombs. The Secretaries of State, War, and Navy met with Truman within a month. They offered their recommendations and formulated an ultimatum to the Japanese government. The public announcement stated that Japan faced ultimate destruction if it did not surrender by March 1, 1946. The Japanese response was silence. How much worse could things get? They believed they could inflict another horrible round of death and finally win a negotiated peace. In the meantime, they organized a new defensive strategy in China as the Soviets continued their offensive. With no response, American B-29s dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima on March 8, 1946. For the Japanese command, it wasn't clear what had just happened. A week later, the situation became brutally apparent. The next bomb drop, on Kakura, blasted away the city on March 15th. The American government reiterated that it would not stop until Japan surrendered. By the third drop on Niigata on March 22nd, internal strife tore apart the ruling military committee. It was one thing to die in battle, and another to die on the ground without the ability to resist. The eventual realization was that there were hundreds of thousands of additional injuries and deaths due to nuclear radiation. They may have thought, was Kyoto next, or Tokyo? Would the emperor even survive, assuming the Americans bombed his palace? Forces outside the ruling coalition took matters into their own hands and initiated a coup that toppled the government and freed the emperor. To make matters worse, Soviet armored columns broke through the defensive lines in China and isolated Japanese forces. It looked probable that the USSR would join the invasion of the home islands. To avoid a fourth atomic bombing and a communist invasion, the Japanese accepted unconditional surrender terms. Regardless of the challenges of Operation Olympic, Allied forces had finally gained their foothold on the Japanese mainland. Truman was committed to using conventional forces and refused to deploy atomic weapons. To avoid causing tremendous casualties, the US and Allied war planners sought to weaken Japanese resistance by every means. With the war over in Europe, Allied bomber wings made their way to the Japanese theater, joined by hundreds of long-range and ground attack fighters. The beefed-up Allied air forces placed the home island's significant population and industrial centers within combat range. While the ground forces reconstituted, waves of heavy bombers ramped up aerial bombardment. Targets of military value, such as railroads, refineries, and arsenals, came under sustained air assault. Their destruction is expected to ease the Allied landing and occupation efforts. Non-military targets, including cities and farmland, were included in the bombing. The US bombing wings had firebombed major cities throughout 1944 and 1945 to horrifying effect. This had not broken the Japanese government's willingness to fight, and the civilians fled cities to the relative safety of countryside towns. With reinforcements, the bombing waves targeted smaller cities and towns. To further terrorize the Japanese and weaken resistance, Allied planners began to arm bombers and transport planes with herbicides. During the planning stages of Operation Downfall, American leaders toyed with the possibility of using chemical weapons. Fear of retaliation prevented US forces from seriously employing gas. US commanders pivoted after taking tremendous losses during the Olympic landings. American leaders resorted to poisoning agricultural regions to starve Japanese civilians and soldiers gradually. Naval forces contributed to weakening the Japanese war effort. For months, the US employed submarine attacks on Japanese shipping. Now, the US Navy has begun a full-fledged blockade. Carrier groups supported the Allied bombing campaign, focusing on ports and shipping. Soviet forces also contributed. By overrunning the defending bulk of the Japanese troops in China, Communist forces prevented the Imperial Japanese Army from reinforcing Honshu for the eventual invasion of Tokyo. With former Japanese-occupied zones captured, the Soviets were ready to assist US and UK forces in the invasion. With US naval support, a diversionary attack was planned. Russian leaders were eyeing taking the Kuril Islands, and they could accomplish more with US support. Hokkaido was to be the Soviets' target. Under sustained and constant attack from the air and sea, their prospects looked stronger for Coronet. The landing on the Kanto Plain was slated for April 1st, 1946, with Allied forces gathering in preparation to hit the beaches. Contrary to some Allied leaders' hopes, Japanese forces fought with surprising, suicidal ferocity. After withstanding the Japanese counterattack, US forces stabilized the front and, with armored and artillery support, captured Tokyo. Days later, Soviet troops landed on Hokkaido and raced to secure the island. As Allied forces enveloped the capital, the emperor evacuated to Kyoto and prepared to offer an unconditional surrender. His government agreed out of fear of further Soviet occupation. The death and destruction was catastrophic, reminiscent of Germany, and in some areas even worse. After the surrender, Japan is divided into occupation zones, which would become entrenched during the Cold War, a Japanese copy of Germany. Korea fell entirely under the sway of communist movements and government. The decision to enforce an unconditional surrender through conventional military means proved costly and ugly. Truman's reluctance to use atomic bombs may have saved cities from monstrous destruction, but at the cost of hundreds of thousands, or possibly millions, dying horribly. There was no noble or honorable victory in the cards, only destruction. Thanks again to World of Tanks. Click our link in the description, register today using our activation code COMBAT, and receive a free Tier 6 tank, the Cromwell B medium tank, a 7-day World of Tanks premium account, 250,000 credits, as well as a free 10-battle rental of the Tiger 131 heavy tank, a T-78 tank destroyer, and Type 64 light tank.